Good afternoon. Thank you for coming inside on such a beautiful day. It's really extraordinary weekend, and we've been enjoying the music inside too. This is our third performance today of the concert, and we hope that you will enjoy it as well. You'll see we have our mics up because we are recording, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But let me start with the second half of the concert, which is probably the piece that is most familiar to all of you. That's Brahms' Symphony Number 3. Brahms wrote 4 symphonies, as you know, and each one is a masterpiece. In fact, it's very hard for me to pick a favorite. You may have your favorite of Brahms, but I always feel that whatever one I'm doing at that time, I'm completely convinced is the most beautiful. But they all are wonderful, partly because Brahms started to write them when he was a mature composer. He waited till he was 43 to begin to write a symphony. And for a German composer, that was very startling and very disconcerting for his public, who wanted him to write symphonies. But Brahms felt he wasn't ready because he was so aware of the shadow of his icon who went before him, Beethoven. And he felt that Beethoven had elevated the symphony to a level that no one could ever reach with his 9 symphonies. And Brahms felt to step into that role was impossible for him. Although he tried, and I'm sure he thought about it all of his life. Finally, at the age of 43, he attempted his first symphony, and it was a masterpiece, and all of the others followed, and they are great. So the third is actually the least often played for 2 reasons. It's the most difficult, although you might not know that. It's internally very difficult, and the rhythm is very, very hard. No, you would be surprised, but I'm absolutely serious when I tell you the rhythm of Brahms' Third is much more difficult for us than Stravinsky or any of these modern composers. It's extremely difficult because Brahms is very subtle about always shifting the pulse over. It's not always on the downbeat. Very often it's on the weak beat, and all of a sudden all the bar lines are shifted in our minds, and it's very, very difficult. You might become a little aware of that the music seems to be flowing without really a sense of, well, where's the beat? And Brahms has done that deliberately, so it's very hard to play that kind of music, especially happens in the first movement. You'll see that Brahms is so elastic with where the weight of the bar is that makes it very difficult for us. So that's one reason why it's more rarely played than the others. The other is that it ends softly. And that was something you never did in a symphony, in a German symphony. You always ended loudly because that was how you ended the concert usually, and people had to go out on a burst of energy. And so this was very startling to people. Why would you end a symphony softly? And only someone like Brahms, who was so courageous and so sure of himself at this point. He was 50 when he wrote this piece. He was so sure of himself, and he knew his philosophy about music, that he felt, this is what I want to do. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why he ends it softly. But for some people who are programming, conductors or orchestras or audience, that's a little bit surprising that the piece just dies out with a whisper in a kind of melancholy way. Brahms himself, I think, is a melancholy person in many ways, and I think that that's partly because of the fact that he seemed to not be totally could not totally fit in well with his time. I mean, Brahms was living in the full height of Romanticism, the wonderful movement throughout Europe of just closely tied to literature and painting of hyper-emotional Romanticism. And of course, that was a lot of who he was. I mean, we hear that in his music. But his idols, the people he most admired and based his whole work on, were people from the past. Brahms, I always think of him looking backwards, and he's looking at Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven, and he's using those people as the model for everything he does. So he's taking their structures, their idea of the symphony, their idea of the concerto, their balance, their symmetry, their elegance, their kind of structure, very, very balanced structure, which are the hallmarks of the classical period. He's taking them and he's dragging them into the Romantic period, and he's stuffing into that kind of those boundaries unbelievable emotion and full-blown passion and warmth and incredible dynamic variation. So I always get the feeling with Brahms that this conflict of the restraint and elegance of the classical period, which he so admired, and his own romantic heart, creates a situation of incredible tension in a way, but richness, and it's what makes his music so interesting. It's almost as if it's a hybrid of two worlds, and they are not completely comfortable with each other. I'm not saying that in any bad way. It's a wonderful thing that he has this tension created between these two aesthetics, this balance and order and symmetry, and this incredible passion. And that was Brahms, that passion, that passionate nature. So in this sense, his music is always a little retrospective because he's always looking back. It's always looking, say, oh, wasn't that a beautiful time in the past? And as a result, there sometimes is a sense of melancholy about it, a sort of longing for a kind of order and rightness that's no longer possible in the Romantic age. Things are going in every direction in the Romantic age where they weren't in the Classical age. So because of that, we have this music of incredible richness and passion and complexity. This is the only time Brahms attempted a cyclical symphony. In that, when we say that, we mean that he tied all the movements together by using the same material, similar material in each one, so that unconsciously or subconsciously, all of us get a feeling of, oh, this feels like it belongs. Well, not even analyzing how it happens, because Brahms is so subtle about it and so detailed about it. But he's very, very conscious of trying to knit everything together. The most obvious thing is the end. You'll notice he starts out, first of all, he gives us two big chords in the woodwinds and brass, and then the strings start the melody. And it's an allegro, a vibrant melody, beautiful, beautiful, filled with energy, filled with color. And then at the very end of the fourth movement, instead of ending again with a big chord or timpani roll, he takes that melody, but now it's like a whisper. It's like a reminiscence or a memory, maybe, of just a very far away hint of what started the piece. And the piece just fades away on that little snippet of the opening. Now, what composer would have dared to do that? Only Brahms. I mean, it was amazing that he did that. But listen very carefully to the end. It gets very soft, and you'll hear just the faintest echo of how he started the symphony. It's also in F major, but Brahms spends most of his time in minor keys in this symphony, which is very unusual for a composer, because if you had a piece in a major key, that was where you spent most of your time, in that key. But even though it's in F major, he has us listening most of the time to F minor, C minor, melancholy, dark, turbulent, rich keys, and you'll hear that. Again, his sense of key relationships is uniquely his own. So it makes the symphony pastoral and in some ways very graceful, but also, imbued with the sense of sadness in a little bit. It's autumnal. I think Mary Kunz mentioned that it was autumnal, and it's a word that has been used to describe this symphony because it's in a way a kind of a farewell. Brahms wrote this. He was in Wiesbaden in the Alps, having some time to write in peace and quiet. And he also was sort of in love with a very young woman, a young singer named Hermine Spies, who was singing his music, was a great advocate of Brahms' songs. She sang them, and Brahms was very, very fond of her and was with her in Wiesbaden. And it was romantically involved, but of course Brahms' romantic life was very complicated. He was probably the great love of his life was Clara Schumann, and that would remain always his first and true only love, really. So in the end, he decided not to become further engaged or involved with Hermine, and he said at some point in his life there were two things that he would never attempt. One was an opera, which he never did, and the other was marriage, and he never did that either. So Brahms remained a bachelor all of his life, and some people fantasize that maybe this wistfulness at the end of the Third Symphony is him saying goodbye to Hermine, or maybe even just his understanding that the whole age of classicism was passing, and that was in the past and would never come back. So in a way, it's his kind of romantic farewell to the people he most admired. So you'll form your own feeling about the end of this and the whole wistfulness of the symphony, but it's truly a very, very beautiful work, and in the kind of lovely warmth and gemütlich feeling tempered with melancholy that only Brahms could do in this unique way. So that's the second half. The first half, and the reason we have our mics up is that we are recording the second half of a disc that we're working on of Polish music, partly in honor of our wonderful Polish community here in Western New York, but also because Poland has given us an incredible legacy of great music. You know, we tend to think that Vienna is the center of the music world, or maybe Italy, of course, where the birthplace of opera. But those of you who might have been to Poland or read about Poland, you realize when you're there that the musical life, the musical heritage is unbelievably vibrant and rich, and now as well with more contemporary composers, it is an incredibly musical environment there. So we're putting together a CD. Two of the pieces we recorded last year, you might remember Lutoslawski Concerto for Orchestra, which is one of the great masterpieces of the Polish repertoire, and Szymanowski Concert Overture, which is kind of like a Polish Don Juan, a very wonderful romantic piece for the horns. The first two pieces on our program are also Polish. One that you might not know, Karłowicz, and I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then Wieniawski, both great Polish composers. So at the end of today, we go to work editing everything, and hopefully we'll have this wonderful disc with the BPO playing 4 great Polish works. So we start out with a piece by Karłowicz. I think it was never been played in Kleinhans Music Hall. It's the first time a piece of Karłowicz has been played, and certainly he's not a name that is well known, but he was a great Polish nationalist. He was actually a violinist, which ties in nicely with the next piece, which is written also by a great violinist. He died very young. He was only 32 when he died, but he lived at the time when Poland, after decades and decades of being conquered and ruled by other people, was trying to desperately to regain its independence, its sense of nationalism. And while it could not do that politically at that point, it certainly did it in terms of honoring its culture and developing its culture through its composers, through its writers, through its artists. And the composers particularly were very, very determined to keep the essence of Poland alive in this culture, even though they were forced to speak other languages, they had to conform to other people's laws. They were not going to sacrifice their culture. Chopin is one of those. I mean, even when you listen to a Chopin mazurka, it's about Poland. I mean, that's a Polish dance that he's writing. I forgot who said this, but they said that all of Chopin's music is, because he was, fiercely nationalistic, even though he was a very gentle man, is like a canon covered in flowers, because he's making the point about free Poland. Well, Karłowicz did the same thing, and he also had studied a great deal in Berlin, so he brings to his music a kind of influence of Richard Strauss and Richard Wagner. Now, Richard Strauss, of course, the great tone poem writer, Don Juan and Till Eulenspiegel and Zarathustra, all of these. This is a new form for the German composer, tone poems. And Karłowicz loved that idea, and he wrote 6 tone poems towards the end of his life based upon his admiration for Richard Strauss. We hear the last of them, called A Sad Tale. It's very short. It's only about 9 minutes long, and it's very dark, but very beautiful. I think in the middle of it, you might hear some of the influence of Strauss and Wagner in the harmonies. The richness and the beauty and the romanticism of the harmonies come right from his training in Berlin. But the whole thing is suffused in darkness. And he never tells us what the sad tale is deliberately. There's no specific storyline, but it ties in with what I have learned is a word that Polish people use, it's spelled Z-A-L, called żal, and it's a kind of a sadness that is always present. So for the Polish people, even in the midst of a great celebration or the happiest music, there's always a sense that sadness is there underneath and that sadness will return. And he was very, very conscious of that. So this is, in a way, a kind of expression of that. So in our lives, always there's going to be these dark moments. And in a way, it was very sadly prescient for him, because he finished this piece and he was killed soon afterwards, after he finished this. So we're hearing his last work at the age of 32. He was an avid mountain climber, and he was climbing and was killed in an avalanche. And I'm told that in Poland, even today, and this is over 100 years later, people mark that anniversary of the day that he was killed and visit the spot where he perished on the mountains. But it will be a new discovery for you, a very romantic but very dark Polish voice. And then we moved to something much lighter, much more brilliant, Henri Wieniawski, a great Polish composer who was a virtuoso violinist. And at the age 8, he was actually sent to the Paris Conservatory. He was so gifted that he couldn't learn anymore where he was. He was sent as an 8-year-old to study at the conservatory. And like every true virtuoso, the pieces he wrote for himself. He wrote pieces to challenge himself, and of course he would have played this concerto that you hear today. He was living at the time when the virtuoso was just coming into play. We were people like Chopin, Franz Liszt, Paganini, Niccolo Paganini were just coming into the public attention, this idea of a virtuoso. And we have our own virtuoso in Michael Ludwig to play this incredible piece. So I asked Michael if he'd come out and have a talk with me about this work and share his insights with you. Welcome, Michael. Welcome, Michael. This is the third time we get to play this piece, which is so wonderful. I was just saying to people that around the time of Wieniawski is really the time when the idea of a virtuoso came into being. Mozart was writing violin concertos, but not thinking of them as virtuoso vehicles. He was thinking of them as wonderful music. But all of a sudden we had Paganini, we had Franz Liszt, people who were playing to astonish the audience, right? And Wieniawski was one of these, wasn't he?
Yeah. He apparently was quite a showman and definitely a virtuoso violinist, which you can tell from the writing of how he exploits the possibilities of the instrument.
Well, you've played, of course, violin concertos written by non-violinists. Is it very different when you're playing a concerto written by someone who knew the instrument so well? How can you tell? What are the fingerprints of that?
Well, the certain kind of techniques of the instrument that show up in the writing, you can certainly tell. I mean, it's hard to explain in words, but you can tell that it was written by a violinist. But what's nice about this piece is that although there's a lot of violin playing in it, there's just a lot of lyricism, just beautiful passages. Wieniawski had a great way of spinning a nice melody, and so there are all these soaring romantic lines throughout the music. So I end up looking at it more as like a beautiful song that has some virtuoso passages in between here and there, but there's just so many wonderful melodies, and so it's a lot of fun to play.
Quite a lot of virtuoso passages, though, sprinkled heavily throughout.
Yeah.
But that's the key to how wonderful a composer Wieniawski is that he's writing music that is first wonderful music, and then a vehicle for a great virtuoso. So that was not always the case. I mean, sometimes Franz Liszt would err on the side of just making something as showy as possible, but Wieniawski doesn't. He starts with something that is wonderful music, and you'll hear that especially in the second movement, in which he simply has the violin singing. It's like singing a ballad to you, a love song, and in some ways in the simplest possible way, although it's not at all simple to play it, but he puts the music first, and then of course sprinkles it very liberally with astonishing passage work for the violinist. So what is it like, Michael, when people hear you on the stage as concertmaster? Now you step forward and you're playing in the front of the orchestra, you're playing for your colleagues. And Michael and I worked on this piece, did this piece in the summer in Beijing in China. Does it feel differently now bringing it back to Buffalo?
Oh, sure. I think every experience is a little bit different wherever you go, and we always encounter either new people or we have old friends in other places that we come across, and so this is a very different dynamic where we're working with people that we know so well and that we see on a week-to-week basis. So there's a lot of comfort in that, and it makes it a really special experience.
Is there a little pressure, too, performing for your colleagues, or all of whom have been just dazzled by this?
Yeah, well, I think there's always a little pressure. There's pressure to perform up to a standard, and I think, so we experience that, I think, wherever we are, to just want to do the music justice and do the best that we can, so, yeah.
I'm so glad that Michael is playing this piece this year because, see, the last couple of years, at my request, Michael has done some unusual solo repertoire. Last year, he played a piece that composer Darren Hagen wrote for him called Songbook. The year before, you might remember, he played a very difficult red violin concerto by John Corigliano, which is really challenging and very contemporary. So this is your chance to play a typical violin, a violinist piece. You know, it just shows off the instrument. So I'm so glad that people will hear this facet of your playing too, and it's wonderful to have the orchestra also hear that. Now, Michael was talking to a group of young students yesterday in the intermission, and so it was interesting. One of the young students, who were all string players, asked Michael which violinist he admired. And I thought maybe that's a good question for me to ask you, so our audience today can hear who, when you think about the violinists that you most emulate and admire, who are they?
Oh, they're all violinists from 50 years ago, 75 years ago. Maybe it's a safe thing for me because I don't have to worry about them as competition. So, but I actually don't think that's really the case because if I was in competition with them, I'd be in big, big trouble. So, but people like Jascha Heifetz, Nathan Milstein, Isaac Stern, when he first came on the scene, was just as good a violinist as anybody on the planet. And they had just a real special way of approaching the instrument and creating unique voices. So they were like singers that you could hear, if you could hear Pavarotti's voice or Sinatra's voice or Dean Martin or any of these singers, you could hear the same thing. You could hear Jascha Heifetz and say, that's Jascha Heifetz. And that's kind of a lost art now. And but that's really something that I admire, is that kind of unique voice that they would bring, and that a serious approach to, and a musical sensibility that was really genuine and authentic.
Yeah, the music always came first with them, and although the technical abilities seemed never to phase them, I mean, Heifetz seemed to be able to play anything, but I think that Michael's playing is very similar to me because I think his sense of color and his sense of direction of the phrase and the singing quality in what you can accomplish on a violin is very similar to those people. Now, sadly, when Michael mentioned those names to the young people, I don't think they knew them, which was really, it was too bad. Did you get that impression too? There were a lot of blank looks when he said Jascha Heifetz, and I thought, oh no. But they will find out because these are all young musicians. So at some point they'll hear the music of Jascha Heifetz. So this is for us an enormous treat to have Michael come to the front of the stage. We are so fortunate to have Michael as our concertmaster, and I don't know if you know that Michael plays really all over the world as a soloist. If you go on his website, you can sort of chart where he's traveling to, which is amazing. And every place he goes, he brings the name of Buffalo, of our home in the Buffalo Philharmonic. So we are very, very proud of you, Michael, and we're so thrilled to do this, and you're in for an enormous treat hearing Wieniawski today. So thank you for coming to the concert.